So how does one define a successful nation in Kenshi? Well, much like in real life, there are many different definitions for what could define a successful nation in Kenshi, depending on what that nation's overall goal is, their values, and generally how they run their nation as a whole. And frankly, it's because of this gray area that we as a community have debated since Kenshi's release about which faction would ultimately have the best chance of success on Kenshi. And sadly, while many of these conversations tend to devolve into incredibly biased rants on Reddit, my hope today is to sit down and definitively articulate which faction on Kenshi can actually succeed on the moon long term. But before I can get to any of that, a quick word from a brand new sponsor of the page, Audible. You see, while I've always enjoyed reading, my wife, on the other hand, is a very huge book nerd. I'm talking about reading several hundred books a year. And she very often has books that she wants me to read as well, but unfortunately, between my responsibilities as a content creator, a husband, a father, and a provider, I very rarely have the time to sit down and read a traditional book. That's where Audible comes in. You see, Audible is a subscription-based service that allows you to buy audiobooks that you can listen to on your phone and on the go. Audible allows you to choose from a gigantic array of audiobooks narrated by amazing narrators that you can listen to from anywhere. And they truly have something for everybody, including podcasts and other genres like science fiction, comedy, romance, health, politics, history, and so much more. And all these things together is why Audible is the leading provider of audiobooks, and I truly cannot recommend them enough. So if Audible sounds right for you and you want to help out the channel at the same time, go ahead and use my link in the description below to sign up for your free trial. And a huge thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video. Now, on to the content. So what would define a successful faction in Kenshi? Well, to be honest, this is wildly different depending on the faction that we're talking about. And because there are so many factions on Kenshi, for the sake of this video, we're going to be focusing on the 5 primary factions of Kenshi, that being those of the Holy Nation, the Shek Kingdom, the United Cities, the Western Hive, and the Tech Hunters. Now, while the definition of a faction's success could be defined differently depending on the faction, we can break it down to one common idea. Success means success for both the faction itself and its people. That means growing a prosperous economy, political stability, a sense of national security, freedom of personal movement, a functional infrastructure, and happiness for its people. Now what I'm going to do is go through one faction at a time and decide whether or not, based on in-game sources, if they meet each of those criterias. I want to preface before I get started, however, that this is not a question of which faction is the most morally correct for Kenshi. This is not a question of which faction is the best for Kenshi. This is not a question of which faction I prefer. This is an unbiased look at each of the 5 major factions to decide which of them has the best chance of creating a successful and long-lasting empire on the face of Kenshi. I only bring this up because this tends to be a topic that gets rather aggressive in the comment sections, and I've seen the Reddit posts. They are not pretty. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and move forward, starting with the Holy Nation. So first things first, does the Holy Nation have a growing and prosperous economy? And the answer is yeah. The Holy Nation has been around for roughly 1,000 years, and in that time, they have managed to position themselves in a position of economic success, and the evidence of that can be seen in most, if not all, of their cities. While they aren't necessarily doing themselves large favors by restricting the kind of trade that they do with other races, there is clearly an economic growth occurring in the Holy Nation. Most, if not all, of their cities are present with market stalls and various shops that have a steady supply of food, weapons, armor, and other goods to sell. And also, the higher-ups in the Holy Nation are capable of paying out rather large bounties to seemingly strangers if provided with the opportunity to do so. And frankly, it helps that most, if not all, of the people who live in the Holy Nation that actively follow the doctrine of the Holy Nation actively participate in the economic growth of the nation. This includes farmers, blacksmiths, traders, even bakers. Everyone provides, and that's part of the way that the Holy Nation functions, is that everybody has a purpose and everybody provides. And that's largely why poverty is not really much of an issue in the Holy Nation. Those that subscribe to their ideas and meet the criteria for what they deem as acceptable are taken care of, and poverty is not really an issue in the Holy Nation. So yes, I would say they have a growing and prosperous economy. Now, moving on to political stability, I don't think we really need to discuss whether or not they're politically stable. They've had the same Phoenix Overlord for at least 1,000 years. And as far as I know, other than the Flotsam Ninja, who are a rather small conglomerate of people who are unhappy under Holy Nation rule, I've never heard of any in-game sources citing any mass rebellions or revolts that would point to political discourse in the Holy Nation. You either agree with them and follow their doctrine, or you leave, provided you're able to leave. So yes, I would say that the Holy Nation does have political stability. Now next we have a sense of national security. So I do think they have a sense of national security, but I think there are certain caveats to that make me question it. You see, centralized Holy Nation territory is relatively safe. The roads are patrolled and there's not much to worry about other than the occasional hungry bandits on the outskirts of Holy Nation territory when you get near towns like Stack. However, the Holy Nation is fighting a war on multiple fronts. You have the Cannibals to the north, the Fogmen to the west, the United Cities to the east, and the Shek to the south. They are fighting on quite literally every front. And it is worth noting that they are doing so very well. They're not seemingly losing any ground in any direction, but it is important to note that when you're fighting an enemy on 4 fronts, that does create a little bit of question about whether or not you can handle that. And there are examples across the face of Kenshi of certain bases having been overrun that used to belong to the Holy Nation, but centralized Holy Nation territory is very secure. So, in summation, yes, I do think there is a good sense of national security, but I'm throwing an asterisk in there because while they are secure, there are some questions about the possibility in the future of whether they can maintain the current front that they're holding. Now next we're going to look at freedom of personal movement, and this is a really important one because it requires 2 things in my mind to be successful. The first being the ability to move about one's own territory without unreasonable fear of the local populace, and that could be in the form of either bandits or the local wildlife, as well as the ability to walk away from one's property without fear of that property being illegally seized by some third party while you're gone. We all know Kenshi has a real squatter problem. And in total honesty, the Holy Nation meets this criteria. The roads are regularly patrolled, the wildlife is kept in check, the local bandit population is kept in check, and the soldiers will actually stop and give food and aid to anybody that meets their religious criteria free of charge. Meaning that most farmers or commoners who don't have battle skills can travel between Holy Nation cities with little to no actual risk to their safety or property. Again, provided you meet their religious criteria. So freedom of personal movement, I would say, yeah, the Holy Nation has it. Next we have infrastructure. And frankly, as for infrastructure, the Holy Nation has a relatively decent infrastructure. Their buildings are well maintained, their cities are well maintained, they hold various choke points and positions of strategic value, not just in their own territory, but in other territories as well. And to be honest, they're able to produce and complete rather large build projects in a very short amount of time. A perfect example being Rebirth, where they're using prisoner labor to create a massive statue of the Phoenix. And as far as we know, that's the current Phoenix, not just some random Phoenix from the past, which means it has only been being worked on for a couple of years or decades at tops. But given the scale of it and the technology that is being used to create such a monolith, it's kind of an impressive piece of infrastructure and architecture. Their roads are properly maintained, and as I said before, they're patrolled as well. So I would say that the Holy Nation does have a functional and successful infrastructure. And lastly, we have the happiness of its people. Now, this is one that's liable to draw up quite a bit of debate in the comment section, but to be honest, the people who live in the Holy Nation that adopt the doctrine and follow its customs actually seem quite happy. Now, that is not to say that there are not plenty of people who are very unhappy with the Holy Nation, some of them having come from the Holy Nation itself. The entirety of the Flotsam Ninja are people who have escaped the Holy Nation due to persecution. The entirety of the Holy Nation outlaws that make up the vast majority of the hub are comprised of people who have fled the Holy Nation. I'm not referring to them. This is simply a list about the people who are actively involved in the nation, about the success and happiness of its current residents. And the Holy Nation boasts numbers that are substantial enough to where I can say that most people that live in the Holy Nation, likely due to the fact that they have been positioning themselves for over 1,000 years to perfectly indoctrinate their people, many of the people that live in the Holy Nation are pretty happy and satisfied. And to be honest, they're safe and well fed. And compared to the vast majority of Kenshi, that is not always the case for many other people. So is it a perfect existence? No. Is it a happy existence for everybody involved? No. But I would say that enough of the Holy Nation citizens are actually happy that I can say yes and throw an asterisk in there because while most are happy, not all. And the all that aren't are unfortunately not happy for a very, very clear reason. So now we have our first faction done. The Holy Nation is complete and we're going to move on to the Shek Kingdom. Now, of the 5 major factions, the Shek Kingdom is usually people's number 1 or number 2 in terms of their favorite factions. So let's find out if the Shek Kingdom meets the criteria for a successful faction. To start things out with a growing or prosperous economy, I would honestly say no. And the reason being is that their economy is almost entirely propped up by other factions. The Western Hive, the Tech Hunters, any scavengers, anything of the sort. They don't have a source of agriculture for themselves. Most of their products are given to them by other people, and they act as more of a third party for transition of goods. They do have some kind of free-flowing money because obviously they're able to pay out large bounties But if they were to be isolated from the rest of Kenshi, I don't think they would be able to keep themselves afloat, such as other nations like the Holy Nation, the United Cities, the Western Hive, or even the Tech Hunters. So it's for that reason that I'm going to say no, the Shek Kingdom does not have a growing or prosperous economy. They have an economy, but it's not a great one. On to political stability, this one should be a no-brainer. They are not politically stable. Granted, since Asada overthrew King Shagger several years ago, that she has managed to bring some stability to the Shek Kingdom, it is very evident that they are not unified and stable by the numerous splinter factions that are opposed to Asada. The Band of Bones, Krall's Chosen, the Berserkers, the list goes on. And even internally, there's a lot of discourse amongst the Shek, many of them complaining that Asada is more of a pacifist and not letting them go and fight the Holy Nation, despite the fact that they know they would lose, openly admitting so in dialogue. And to be honest, given the history of the Shek and their violent tendencies, I wouldn't say that it's going to be very long before Asada is eventually overthrown as well. So no, the Shek Kingdom is not by any means politically stable. Which is largely unfortunate because Asada and her more strategic thinking to hold back against a foe they know they can't beat right now is probably the only thing that's keeping the Shek from being completely obliterated. But moving on to a sense of national security. Again, I'm going to have to go with a no. The Shek are showing no signs of national security. They have 3 splinter factions just in their own territory. Most of their buildings are dilapidated and falling apart, and the only reason that I think the Shek have been able to maintain their position for as long as they have is because they hold positions of strategic value like choke points in Squin or areas that are high up with very low ground, allowing them to see very far in places like Admag. They have a strong sense for strategic value, but they do not have a strong sense of national security. They're being pushed back constantly. They were almost completely obliterated by the Holy Nation in their last attempt to commit war with them. And this could change as time goes on, now that Asada has taken over and has put the Shek in more of a defensive position instead of an offensive position, allowing them to rebuild. But at current, they are not secure nationally at all. Their borders are very, very uncontrolled. And that kind of leads into the next one, which is freedom of personal movement. And as said before, we have to worry about 2 things on this particular piece of criteria, which is that you have to be able to leave your property and move about your nation's own territory with minimal threat to oneself, or a reasonable amount of threat given that this is still Kenshi, and the ability to leave one's property without fear of that property being taken, or at the very least knowing that your own government will help take it back if it is. And in that regard, the Shek also get a no from me. The entirety of the Shek lands are plagued by splinter factions, bandits, wildlife, and the Shek, because of their militaristic doctrine, in the event that you were to lose your property, it's your own fault and they're not going to help you. In fact, if anything, they're going to persecute you further because you were too weak to defend your own property. In a society based on strength, losing one's property is not exactly a sign of strength, and they're not going to help you take your land back. So no, freedom of personal movement is not something that I would consider the Shek having. So moving on, we have infrastructure, and this one I will give the Shek a bit of leeway with the infrastructure. They do have an infrastructure. Granted, some of the buildings are dilapidated and falling apart, but they do hold positions of strategic value. And while I didn't get into it too much with the Holy Nation, they do have a very clear hierarchy in place. They have the means of protecting their own cities. They have jobs, functions. The infrastructure for a society is there, but it is still kind of rudimentary because Asada just took over and essentially overhauled the entirety of what was the Shek Kingdom prior to her taking over. So I'm going to give them a yes with an asterisk because it could go either way right now, but they are on their way to creating something good. It's just not fully there yet. And next we have to look at the happiness of its people. Now this one, same thing. I'm going to give them a little bit of leeway because there is some stuff happening, but it's not quite there yet. You see, a lot of the people in the Shek Kingdom are feeling kind of annoyed and disenfranchised, specifically with Asada, and it's because she refuses to let them do what they feel that they need to do and go fight the Holy Nation. They want to combat the Ochre Knights, and they know they're going to die doing so. But I'm going to give them a yes because while the people of the Shek Kingdom may be frustrated with the fact that they cannot go fight the Ochre Knight dogs to the death, the fact that they have the citizens at all to even be frustrated about that fact is entirely thanks to Asada. So are they necessarily happy? Maybe not. But they're alive to grumble about their problems, so I'm going to give them a yes with an asterisk because yes, but no. And that kind of sums up the Shek Kingdom, and as you can see, it's very clear upon looking at it, the Shek Kingdom is not moving in a good direction. And to be honest, at the rate that they're going, if the political discourse continues, if things continue to build against the Sana and they're not able to unify soon, I don't foresee the Shek Kingdom lasting very long into the future. They're a relatively new nation in comparison to a lot of the other ones, having been very tribal before, and I have the feeling that they're going to end up reverting to a tribal kingdom again in the future, but who knows? So moving on, we have the United Cities. Now, to kick things off, does the United States have a growing and prosperous economy? And the answer is yes, with an asterisk. And let me explain why. The United Cities is the home to the Traders Guild, and they are massive, massive hubs of economic boom. Every city is filled with markets and shops and bars, and they trade with the Western Hive, they trade with each other, they have all of these economic things happening. But it used to be a lot more, and they're also on the verge of a full economic collapse. You see, recently, the Holy Nation attacked the region of Bast, which many people don't realize was the United States' agricultural hub. That's where all of their food was being produced, or at least the vast majority of their food. That dealt a serious blow to their economy. On top of that, while the Traders Guild is a main source of economy, they also function far more like the mafia, often threatening people, using intimidation tactics, coercion, and other sly, underhanded tactics to make the economy move. This, in conjunction with the fact that almost their entire economy is propped up on slave labor during a time when the socioeconomic situation in the United States is that of peasant revolts, is not looking good. And then to top it all off, most, if not all of the wealth in the United States isn't even distributed amongst the people, creating a growing and prosperous economy. It's mostly spread between trade with other nations and the nobles that tend to kind of run the individual cities. Most of the populace in the United Cities are not economically stable. You have two classes in the United Cities. You have dirt poor peasants and nobility, and then maybe the soldiers and samurai in between there, but the line is very, very firm. You're either poor or you're rich. You are not middle class. That does not exist in the United Cities. So while they do have a very, very functional economy, I would almost say that the United Cities economy is in the downtrend. So I'm going to give it to them and say yes, with an asterisk, because at current, the economic situation in the United Cities is not looking good. So moving on, we have political stability. And this one, I'm going to go with a solid no. The political leader of the United Cities is supposed to be Emperor Tengu, and then his nobles are supposed to deliver out his word and run each individual city as they need to fulfill his wishes. But that is not what happens. Tengu is essentially a figurehead, and the nobles individually run their cities however they feel, often wildly abusing the subjects in those cities. This, coupled with the other economic issues that I talked about before, and the severe classism that happens in the United Cities, has all culminated into mass peasant revolts against Emperor Tengu and his nobles. So no, they are not politically stable because they are actively going through a revolt trying to overthrow the current government because of how unstable this government is. In fact, largely the only reason that the United Cities is so big as it is because they took over a lot of the old cities when the Second Empire fell. Most of its expansion wasn't even actually expansion, it was just the bones of what was a previous empire that united under a single banner, but frankly, it's falling apart. So no, they are not politically stable. Moving on to a sense of national security, again, that is a hard no. The United States is actively going through a peasant revolt right now, and that peasant revolt is because of how unsafe it is, not only from external threats, having just been attacked by the Holy Nation and lost pretty much every settlement they had in the region of Bast, but also internal threats with mass abuse happening at the hands of the nobles and the samurai. And then, to top it all off, the military and police force is incredibly corrupt, often extorting its citizens for fear of jail time or being turned into a slave. So no, national security is not a thing. They're under current fire from the Holy Nation in the north, and they're fighting internally due to political discourse. So no, sense of national security is a hard no. Next, we move into freedom of personal movement. And again, I'm going to have to go with a hard no. The United States territory is very treacherous to move about. It is a giant desert that is filled to the brim with skimmers, which are one of the most annoying enemies in Kenshi, especially early on. And then aside from that, you're not even safe from bandits, you're not safe from peasants, you're not safe from racist United States heroes. There are so many threats that could attack you on your way moving about through the United States territories that it is uncanny that anyone can move anywhere at all. And quite frankly, freedom of movement is not just restricted in terms of moving throughout one's own faction, but also in the idea that you could leave your property behind. The United States seizes property all the time. The nobles seize property all of the time. They also collect ridiculous taxes, and if you don't pay those taxes, which are exorbitantly large, they will seize your property and take your life. And if you were to lose your property to some third party, for the average citizen living in the United States, not for the player that's, got a 90% allied relationship with them, but for the average person living in the United States as a commoner, the United States samurai or police force are not going to go out of their way to help take back your property if it was taken by a third party. If anything, they would extort you for the supposed effort that they would have to put in. So no, I don't believe that the United States gives you personal freedom of movement in any sense of the word. The roads are dangerous, the faction is entirely treacherous, and in the event that you leave, your property is not protected. Now, moving on to infrastructure, I will say the United States has a solid infrastructure. The only caveat to that might be roadways, but given that they live in a desert, I can forgive that because you can't really build solid roads in a desert. But their buildings are all properly maintained. Everyone has a job. It's just most of those jobs kind of suck, but they're there. And in terms of sheer scale, the United States boasts some of the largest cities out of any faction in the game, as well as some of the most aesthetically creative cities in the game. And they're able to maintain a wide variety of not just outposts, but cities and slave trade camps, and they have just a wide variety of infrastructure and buildings and jobs and everything that is required of a successful nation. They just, unfortunately, do it rather poorly. But all of the mechanics are there, and the chance of success is pretty high in terms of their infrastructure. But it's also built on the bones of the Second Empire, so we don't actually know how much of that work was done by the United States. But regardless, the infrastructure is there, so I'm going to give them a solid yes for infrastructure. And lastly, we're going to move on to the happiness of its people, and that is a hard and definitive no. They're actively going through a peasant revolt because of how miserable their people are. The only people in the United States that are happy are the ones that are swinging the whips or the nobles that are abusing the commoners. Everyone other than the people who are at the top end of the economic pool are miserable. So no, it is a very clear and decisive no. The people of the United States on average are not happy. And having closed that out on the United States, we can go ahead and move on to the next faction, being that of the Western Hive. So first things first, does the Western Hive have a growing and prosperous economy? And the answer is yes, they do. In fact, the Western Hive is one of the largest sources of trade in the game, next to that of the Traders Guild in the United States. Their caravans can be found pretty much everywhere. Now, they are very frugal too, so their prices are astronomically high. So if they're selling as much stuff as I imagine they would be with the number of caravans they have going out selling their goods, I can only imagine the amount of money that they have access to. And given that most of their buildings are made from their own vomit, the only thing they really have to worry about is parts and supplies to make more stuff, to sell more stuff. Their economy is essentially a revolving wheel of their own creations being sold to fund their new creations, to sell to fund their new creations, and it's just an endless cycle. But honestly, even if everything they produce is crap, the pure volume of caravans they have going through Kenshi, they have to be making a solid dollar. So yes, I will go ahead and say that the Western Hive does have a growing and prosperous economy, and as the Hive gets bigger, the economy only gets propped up even further. And next we look at political stability, and I don't think this one really needs to be talked about too much because the Hive is incredibly stable. The single queen uses pheromones to keep her people in check, and if they're not subservient to her, then they are cast out of the Hive and become hiveless. And with the way that the Hives function, everyone who is still actively involved in that pheromone link all acts as a collective, a singular Hive mind. There is no thought, there is no desire, there is only service and loyalty to the queen. So yeah, the Hive is incredibly politically stable. Good luck trying to overthrow the Hive. You might be able to kill the Hive, but overthrow them? No, almost definitely not. So next we have the sense of national security, and for this one, I put no. The reason being is that while everyone operates in a singular link and a hive mind, they don't really put any defense on their outlying villages or anything of the sort. The main hive of the Western Hive, where the queen is residing, is its own island and is relatively well defended, and I can't foresee any nation wanting to go out of their way to try and sack the Western Hive. It's just not of any strategic value or honestly any economic value to them, as most of what they produce is lower quality, or at least that's what they bring to the other nations. So as far as they know, everything the hive produces is lower quality. But in terms of national security, they don't do a very good job of defending their villages. They have numbers and some guards, but there's no infrastructure set up to aid in that defense. It's just not there. And to be honest, it kind of creates this idea that maybe the queen thinks of most of her people as just replaceable, which I can understand why she would. She can literally just make more. But as a result, she doesn't really put much of an emphasis on national security. She puts more of an emphasis on personal security. And most of the hivers are pretty clear about that. Everything is to protect the queen. They don't really care about their own lives. They care about the queen's lives. And the way that her nation and faction is set up, it's pretty evident that that's the case. So sense of national security, it's a no. Because they don't really have a sense of national security. They have a sense of security for the queen and only the queen. Next is freedom of personal movement, and I put yes with an asterisk on this one. As a byproduct of the way that the Hiver's pheromone link works, you don't really have to worry about losing property or anything of that sort because they don't have a concept of property. They have a concept of this belongs to the hive, the collective, the whole. But in terms of freedom of movement around one's own territory, there is some debate on that because a lot of their bases are surrounded by things like beak things and gorillas, and there's not much defense in that regard. So I gave it kind of a yes with an asterisk because the answer is half yes. You don't have to worry about one's property because property is not really a thing for the hive. But freedom of personal movement within one's own faction's territory, it gets a little mucky right around there. So yes and no, but I'm going to give them yes with an asterisk. Moving on, we have infrastructure, and the Western Hive does have an infrastructure. It is their own infrastructure. It's very unique to them because of the way that the pheromone link works, but they do have an infrastructure. There's a very clear hierarchy. There's a very clear way that they build their buildings. They have farms. They have everything they need to create a successful faction in the future for the way that their faction operates. So I would say that in terms of the way that the Western Hive functions, it does have a successful infrastructure. It's kind of lacking roads, but again, as previously stated, everything is built for success of the queen and defense of the queen. You don't really need to connect individual villages because they're not going between villages for trade internally. Everything is done externally. Everything is done via collective hive mind. So internal roads from village to village, it doesn't really make sense for the way the hive operates. So in short, yes, they have a successful infrastructure. It's just very unique to the way that the hives function. And lastly, the happiness of its people. This one, again, that's an easy yes. Everyone who is part of the hive is happy and content with the hive because the pheromone link makes them that way. They are part of a collective. There is no desire and there is no want. There's nothing beyond love and loyalty for the queen. It's hard to really think about happiness when the only thing you have is loyalty for your queen. You don't have any ideas, any identity, any thought. You just do as the pheromone link tells you. So, I mean, I guess, are they happy? The answer could be no, because they don't have any individuality, but I would say that they live in a giant collective hive mind, and everyone that is in that hive mind is happy. And that's evidenced by the fact that when they lose that pheromone link, they oftentimes take their own life out of pure depression from not being part of that collective anymore, from having the weight of consciousness that comes from it. So I would say that a simple existence is a happy existence in the terms of the hivers and their pheromone link. So yes, the hive consists of a relatively happy people in a definition that is unique to the hive, but happy nonetheless. So now that we've finished up with the Western Hive, we're going to move on to the last major faction in Kenshi, the Tech Hunters / Mechanists. So firstly, do the Tech Hunters have a growing and prosperous economy? And the answer is yes. In fact, that is like one of their main things. They find old world tech, and they do so for two reasons. One, to work as essentially mobile historians, gathering up old information about the empires of old and the history of Kenshi, but also collecting this old tech so that they can sell it. And as a result, the tech hunters have a very prosperous economy throughout their faction. And this is despite only having a handful of major outposts throughout Kenshi, but also being in control of the vast majority of the way stations throughout Kenshi. They do have a functioning and prosperous economy. Now, whether we can determine if that economy is connected and interwoven in such a way where you could even call it a faction economy as opposed to a local economy, that's another discussion. But I would say as a whole, the tech hunters do have a growing and prosperous economy. Next, we move on to political stability, and I give them a no because they don't really have a political system in place. They have the leaders in the sense of Finch and Io, but they don't really have a political system in place, as the tech hunters more or less function as a group of independent contractors that go out and find loot and valuables. They're more like scavengers or wanderers that all fall under one collective banner, but they're not like a large collective group that falls under one political banner, just a name. If you're a scavenger, you're a tech hunter, even if you don't necessarily affiliate with other tech hunters. So no, I didn't put them as politically stable because they don't really have a political system. Next, we have sense of national security, and I put yes with an asterisk for similar reasons that I would say no on the political stability. They do have a sense of national security at their main strongholds. Places like World's End and Flats Lagoon are very well defended, and when you're inside those cities, you can feel relatively safe and protected. You're not going to be getting attacked by much, if anything, because they hold strategic value. And because of that, there is a sense of security with that. Also, the fact that they don't have a political system means that no one's really going out of their way to eliminate the tech hunters. No one's really at war with the tech hunters because they operate as independent contractors operating under a unified name rather than an actual group of people that are unifying under a single political banner. It doesn't really function that way. So I would say they have a sense of national security that is unique to the function and the way that the tech hunters operate. So yes, with an asterisk. Moving on, we have freedom of personal movement, and this is a hard yes for the same reasons that I've stated before. I don't really have to worry about freedom of personal movement in one's own territory because they don't really have a large territory. They have individual cities and individual outposts, and those outposts are generally pretty well defended. You can move throughout them without much issue, but I don't have to worry about a surrounding territory or the lands in between because they're more like independent contractors that set up outposts that all unify under a single name, but not a single banner. And if I was a member of the tech hunters, if I would have to worry about them seizing my property, or if I would have to worry about them not taking back my property in the event that it was taken, tech hunters don't typically own property. They have the outposts where they set up shop and they sell their goods, but most of them are traveling, they're roving, they're scavenging. So for the average, quote, tech hunter citizen, which there are none, you wouldn't really have to worry about protection of property because they don't exist outside of the major outposts like the way stations, Flats Lagoon, World's End, and stuff like that. So I'm going to give them a yes with a freedom of personal movement because within the confines of what defines a tech hunter, they do have freedom of movement. In fact, they probably have more freedom of movement than most factions. It's just different than the other factions. Now, as for infrastructure, again, for the same reasons I've stated before, I'm going to say no, they don't have a solid infrastructure. A lot of their bases are self-sustaining, but they're not interconnected. They're not always functional fully. They are passable. You know, the World's End is very isolated. There's not any examples of agriculture happening there. There are no roadways between tech hunter outposts that are not built by the faction that exists there previously, or natural walkways that, you know, accrue due to people naturally traveling to them, but there's not like defined roads, defined agricultural systems, means of power, setup of buildings or anything like that. Most of their buildings seem like they've been reclaimed buildings or buildings that they've set up shop in that previously belonged to another faction. I just wouldn't say that the tech hunters, because of the way that they operate as more independent contractors, would have what I would define as a successful infrastructure. They have an infrastructure, but it is not a successful infrastructure. It's not an unsuccessful infrastructure. It's more like a reclaimed infrastructure, which really kind of follows the motif of what they do. And lastly, we have to look at the happiness of its people. And I would say in large the tech hunters that are still alive, because the tech hunting is a very dangerous profession. You're scavenging into some of the darkest, most dilapidated wastes, the ruins of the First and Second Empire, fighting machine and man alike, and you travel all across the face of Kenshi dealing with things like cannibals and zealots and aggressive southern hivers and who knows what else. Those that survive seem like they're probably pretty happy and they live a meaningful and successful life, and you have to have some kind of passion and love for what you do in order to do it. And one could argue that the people that did not survive to that point probably had some kind of passion as well. They just weren't lucky, or they weren't skilled enough to be successful at it, but they must have been happy to some degree or enjoyed what they were doing to some degree. Now, there are probably some tech hunters that are doing it simply for the financial reasons and they don't want to be doing it, but it is a very lucrative work if you can do it well and you're good at it. So I would say that the happiness of the tech hunters is a general yes, but we're going to put yes with an asterisk because we don't really have a lot of the information we might need to fully assess that. Just things that we can speculate on based on the nature of the career, the nature of the job, and just the kind of people that it would attract and that you would have to be in order to actively pursue that kind of life. And so now we have a pretty clear picture that the faction that seems to have the most chance of success given its current standing on Kenshi is the Holy Nation, which ironically is the oldest of any of these factions that we know of. So I would say that over the last 1,000+ years that the Holy Nation has been around, despite the massive flaws with their beliefs and with the way that they run things, they clearly are doing something right because they have managed to be not only the oldest, but also the most stable out of any of the up-and-coming factions on Kenshi since the fall of the Second Empire. But maybe you disagree with me, maybe you have some ideas or some thoughts that I didn't bring up in this video, and I'd be happy to hear you guys out down below. I love inspiring this kind of conversation. However, I will say that just because I know this is going to be a bit of a polarizing topic, do remember, this is still just a game. It is not a reflection on anyone's personal beliefs. It is not a reflection of their character. It is simply an analysis of a game, and we need to treat each other with respect and be kind. So please use your powers for good instead of evil. Make a difference in someone's life. And again, a huge thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.